I'm with Dr. Tim Baker to find out more.
Dr. Tim Baker, a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Let's just understand what's at the heart of this. One of your central theses in this book is about a mind shift in the way companies operate. Now, in this environment we're in, how are you going to bring about a culture of change there when, frankly speaking, companies are just worried about getting through from day to day and not innovating?
Yeah, well, I think the argument is they won't survive unless they do this. My view is that the employment relationships changed fundamentally over the last 25 years. And what's happened is there's a lot of organisations still operating on a traditional mindset, and I'm arguing now that that mindset has changed significantly. So there has to be a new way of thinking. So organisations can't afford not to. I would argue in the next 5 years there's going to be some organisations that will be lost in the marketplace because they're not applying a new employment relationship.
You've said, as it were, that the rot set in nigh on 20 years ago. Why has it taken us this long to really grasp the nettle, as it were, over it all?
Yeah, well, I think that the employment relationship's been around for 200 years, since the Industrial Revolution. So therefore we are all aware of the traditional employment relationship. So to be able to step back from that and say, and look at it in a critically reflective way is not an easy thing to do. But it's only been a space of 25 years that this whole concept of how employees look at employers and how employers look at employees has changed significantly. So it's relatively new.
What really was the tipping point? We went through, 175 years up to the 1980s, A-OK, then suddenly went over the edge. So what happened?
Well, there was a lot of retrenching and downsizing in the 1980s. There's a significant number of middle management that was ripped out of organisations, and what that did is employees started getting very cynical and very angry with organisations, and their faith in the whole or traditional employment relationship broke down at that particular time.
Then again, you acknowledge in your book that this happened to an extent in the 1930s, the Great
Yes.
Depression, people were laid off, and then we sprang back again. So what was different about the 1980s that didn't quite work that same way?
I think the big difference was there was a stable environment in the 1930s relatively. In the 1980s there was a significant change. There was a lot of accelerated change and uncertainty, and that brought a greater focus on the employment relationship, whereas in the 1930s it was a pretty stable environment, apart from, of course, some of the issues that occurred in the Great Depression.
You're pretty critical, end of the day, about human resource departments. Even the language of HR, you say,
Yes.
is pejorative. Now, if they are effectively the gatekeepers of this whole process, how are management going to bring about change if it's frustrated by that very department?
Yeah, well, first of all, the term human resources is a derogatory term because it's implying that an employee is like a photocopier or a piece of technology that's owned by the company, and people don't see it that way.
Can't you, though, literally give people ownership in a company, give them a shareholding of it so that they do feel that they are part of a property and will work to improve it?
That's true, but the mindsets between employer and employee have to change to make that work. But a lot of people are giving lip service to this whole concept of empowerment, but they're not actually considering it. What's in the interest of the employee? What's in the interest of the employer? That whole relationship fundamentally has to be looked at differently.
Do you think we've become somewhat selfish as a society, though, that we are thinking all the time about, well, this needs to happen in the employee's point of view, when, frankly speaking, we should be jolly grateful that we're in the job that we're in without going and knocking on the door after 5 minutes in the corner office expecting to do something quite different?
Well, I think it's in both interests. I mean, what organisations need now more than ever is to be manoeuvrable in the workplace. They need to be flexible. What employees need now is to be employable. The whole concept of job security is out the window. So these whole needs have changed fundamentally. So what my model is actually saying is there's a fundamental difference, and therefore it's actually in both interests. And there's a third interest, of course, which of course is the customer.
Training, though, by definition, is going to involve further investment. Can you understand, again, though, in this environment, that people would be more than reluctant to go down that path?
That's true, but as some of my clients say to me, why should we spend money training people when they up and leave? My argument is if you don't train them, they'll up and leave anyway. So there's an expectation amongst employees, particularly younger generation, they expect to be trained up. So it should be seen as an investment. It's all about trying to keep employees engaged in that company for longer periods of time than would normally be the case. I mean, the average employee now stays less than 2 years in the one company, and that time is actually reducing. So the issue for organisations is how do we, first of all, find and how do we keep our good people for significantly longer than they would normally stay.
You've identified 8 values of competitive organisations. Just what exactly are they?
I'm basically saying that if these 8 values, which include flexible deployment, customer focus, focus on performance, project-based work, human spirit and work, commitment, open information and learning and development. Now, if those values are part of the organisational culture, it's actually in the interest of the company. It's also in the interest of the employee as well.
How smart a strategy, as it were, is it to be sweeping everyone up and saying, look, everyone inside that organisation is entitled, as a God-given right, to training, when perhaps we should be being more selective in who we choose to undertake that process?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about Generation Y and how their expectations are quite different. I think there's a trend, there's a general trend out there, and that trend's going to become stronger. I predict in the next 5 years what we'll find is that companies that embrace the traditional employment relationship will actually attract to them employees that are of that ilk, and vice versa. So organisations that are promoting the new employment relationship will attract to them those employees who have those mindsets. So I see the marketplace actually, and it's already occurring, I actually see it splitting. So employees are becoming more discretionary about where they work. I'm talking about the top employees. And those employees are asking more questions at interviews, and they want to know what the company's culture is all about. So this is one way of insulating and ensuring that you find and attract good people.
Is it fair to say that there are some industries that are always going to be cyclical by their very nature, that attrition is going to occur regardless of additional steps that might be taken?
Yeah, look, I think there's always going to be a turnover of staff, but the issue is every time a staff member leaves, it costs significant amounts of money, not only just to find another person, but also to train them up. Not only that, the knowledge that that worker has goes with that worker. So it's a significant impost on companies that have a high turnover rate. So pragmatically, you'd say, well, how do we reduce our turnover? You'll never get it to zero, but you can get it less than it perhaps is.
How much, though, is Australia rather constrained by its geography? In other words, you can train up someone as much as you like, but there will come a point where they just want to spread their wings. They want to go and get that international experience, regardless of how inventive you've been inside a company.
Well, I'd encourage that, but I think the point is if they're leaving because they're unhappy, that's quite a different story to if they leave because they want to spread their wings, as you say. So it's really about trying to keep your top performers in that organisation engaged for longer than would normally be the case. There's always going to be a need for people that want to move, and I think my advice to any employee is perhaps to get a variety of experience out there in the marketplace.
Sure, that's all well and good, but if you don't have those international relationships, you can't exactly bring that about.
That's right. But I actually think that, you see a lot of companies now doing exchanges with their employees, large corporations. I think that's very healthy, both for the individual and the organisation, because there's a cross-pollinisation. It gives the employee an opportunity to try a new experience. So I think it's a good thing. I think that's part of the new employment relationship, is actually encouraging that kind of behaviour.
When you look offshore, who actually is getting this right?
I think we're in flux between the traditional employment relationship and the new employment relationship. There are a few companies, but there aren't many that are doing it right. There's a couple of companies out there that are well known. Google is one, Apple is another, and if you look at what happens with those organisations, they're quicker to marketplace. They have very low staff turnover and very high productivity. But if you pick up the popular management literature, you would think that there's a lot of companies out there that are high-performance workplaces. But in actual fact, when you scratch the surface, that's not really the case in my experience.
What should employers, though, fundamentally be looking for in candidates today? What has actually changed there?
Well, I think we're looking for people who actually who are liberated enough to be more loyal to their careers than they are to the organisation. Because if you think about it, if an employee is more loyal to their career, they're likely to speak up at meetings and not play organisational politics. They're likely to do what's right by the customer. They're likely to want to become multi-skilled. So therefore, those are the sorts of traits that companies should be looking for. But if their mindset is stuck in the traditional them and us concept, then it's likely that they'll feel threatened by individuals that feel that way.
Have you got a sense financially on just how much it's costing us as an economy for not going down this inventive path?
it's very difficult to quantify, but if you've got high turnover, if you've got inflexible organisational structures, if you're slow to market, these are all symptomatic of the them and us relationship that's been around for 200 years. If you add all those things up, that's a significant cost. Very difficult to quantify, but nevertheless, you know, any of your viewers that are in business would understand that those sorts of costs are costs that can't be embraced.
What's been the response, though, from those who you've interviewed to compile this book? Have you found managers responsive, or have they still got their heads stuck in the sand?
Well, it's interesting. It varies. I mean, you know, I was talking to some young employees the other day, and they completely embraced what I was talking about. They completely understood what I was talking about. I also talked to some baby boomer managers who feel quite threatened by this, and they argue, well, this relationship's worked very well for 200 years. What's changed?
Yeah, but you need to cut through to those ones.
That's correct. That's right. And what's actually changed is that we're in a marketplace now that's got a high acceleration of upheaval. We've got globalisation, higher competition. That's the denominator. That's the issue. And companies want to be involved in that. They have to be involved in that.
What's next for you?
Well,